Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about my passion. First of all, I'd like to say that I've been a passionate book collector all my life. I started at the age of 9, which is quite early, and then I went through collecting various things. This is how my house looks, or bits of the house. I started collecting just general things, then I moved on to travel books, and then I developed a huge library of erotica from the 16th century through to the 20th century. But now I've got a bit older, I sold my erotica, and the only erotic books I still have are those which are connected with language. So I look at erotica from a linguistic and not from a sexual point of view. So this is how you develop, just some advice. As you get older, things change. But what I also wanted to say is that I am a collector. I'm not an academic. I'm not a specialist in languages. I observe, and through my passion, I observe things, and what I'm trying to present to you today are my observations on collecting this is how I collect. I travel around all the time for my work. Here I am in Hong Kong visiting Lily Wang's bookshop. There I am in Kiev at the book market, and this was recently in Zagreb. So I'm traveling around a lot, collecting things, and I have insights. So I'm sure I'm going to say lots of things that for academic ears sounds like rubbish, but don't shout rubbish, just accept the fact that I'm an amateur researcher, and that's it. But please correct me afterwards. I'm very open, and I love being corrected. So what I'm saying is not the truth, it's my observation. So what am I going to talk about? What I'm going to talk about is the role of books in developing languages, creating identities for languages and cultures, going beyond that in the second stage from just recording languages, which was basically what the role of books was in early times, to creating cultural identities, and then after cultural identities, national identities, and even nationalism. These are things that we've talked about yesterday as well. The emergence of national cultures, national identity, and how that's transferred into politics as well. Now, religion is very much at the heart of this, because religion was behind the growth of the first books, the production of the first books. The Luther Bible is a monument not only of religion and the Reformation, but also of the German language, because it incorporated the German language as it was, and it established a set of rules and consistency. Also, the missionary work of the church was very important. The Vatican sent missionaries abroad all over the place, and they needed to learn the local languages. So they produced very much the first grammars in some very obscure languages. And as I'm going to show, you're going to find some languages that are recorded only in the Bible, because otherwise they would have disappeared and we wouldn't have a record of them. So religion, the church, missionary work was vitally important. This is perhaps my greatest treasure, which is, by the way, all the books I'm showing today are in my collection. Okay, so these are things that I've collected over the last 6 years or so. This is the first Bible in Cyrillic, printed in 1581 in Ostrog in Ukraine today. The editor was Ivan Fedorov, and he was sponsored by Prince Konstantin Ostrovsky. And it was a fantastic piece of work, 1,256 pages, based on very different sources, and it was a monument, not just for the Orthodox Church, not just for religion, but it was the first really definitive work, comprehensive work in the Slavonic language. So again, vitally important piece of work for Church Slavonic. Then we have this here is the first, the New Testament in Romanian. You'll see Romanian was then written in Cyrillic. That's going to be a theme later, because Romanian is one of my favorite languages. And this was sponsored by Prince George Rákóczi I, published in 1648, currently in Alba Iulia. And it's an important book because it shows the ideas of the Reformation, which was to bring religion to the people, bring thought to the people in their own language, not just in Latin or in Greek or in Slavonic, but to bring it to them in their own language. This is another very rare book. This is also these are in Romanian. The second one, this is a binding. The second one is Sunday Sermons, Kyriaco Dromion, 1699, also printed in Alba Iulia. It's interesting that these books took a long time to produce, were very expensive. Only a few of these books were produced. And you must imagine, the cost of the book to buy was the equivalent of the cost of a cow. It was a very expensive thing. Here is a New Testament published in Copenhagen in 1818 in a language called Neder-Hollands. We can't be politically correct about this because that's what it was called, Negro Dutch. It was a language that developed on the plantations of the Danish West Indies, and the owners of these plantations were Dutch, and that's why a Dutch Creole developed. The Danish West Indies are known today as the American Virgin Islands. They were purchased in 1917 by the Americans from the Danes. This is in a language called Black Creole. It was a book published by a missionary, Alexander Henderson, in Edinburgh, where we are now. This is an unusual language because it's not a Creole of a European language, but it's a mixture of African languages and local Caribbean languages. It was a language that developed in St. Vincent through the interaction of freed slaves with local indigenous Caribs. Also, the church involved in the propagation of ideas. This was a book that was printed by the Congregatio Propaganda Fide in the Vatican in 1663. Thomas à Kempis, Imitation Christi, is the second most important book in the Catholic Church, and this is the first edition in Arabic. It's a very early book in Arabic. I think it's the first book that was printed in the Vatican in Arabic language. By the way, I found this book in a garage in Slovakia. So this is part of the excitement of looking around. You find things in strange places. And this is an interesting one. This was given to me by a professor of Greek in Budapest, who's a friend of mine. This is the Psalms in Albanian, written by Constantine Christoforid. Christoforid was one of the great Albanian nationalists. He was a priest, and he produced in modern Albanian. He developed, as Albanian was written in Cyrillic, in Arabic script, in Greek script, in every script, and this established a standard for Arabic. And again, it was a religious book, first of all, New Testament, and then the Psalms that were written in modern Albanian. And I had to include this one. This is the New Testament in Scots Gaelic. Date is wrong, 1767. I'm sorry, that was a mistake. It was, I think, one of the first books that was, again, shout at me if I'm wrong, but it's a very early book in Scots Gaelic. It was the first part of the first edition of the first part of the Bible. Previously, Bibles in Irish Gaelic had been circulated in Scotland, but people didn't really understand them, so they had very little purpose. And this book was also not particularly successful because people really didn't understand the language. This was an attempt also to try and structure and formalize Scots Gaelic so that it was not just whatever written in a way that came into people's head, but to supply a standard. But this was not a very successful work at the time. Here we have in Breton also the first edition of the New Testament in Breton. It came a bit later in 1827. Here we see again, this book is a grammar of Hindustani written in Portuguese, published in the Vatican in 1787. Or 1778, sorry, and it was published for Portuguese missionaries in India so that they could speak to the local population and do their missionary work. The other book, which is Neger English, or the language of Suriname, also known as Srenan Tongo, but an alternative. Oh, you're a fan of Srenan Tongo, are you?
I was in Suriname last.
Okay, and you learned Srenan Tongo.
I learned Dutch, actually.
Okay, but you could have learned this language. I'm sure it would have been much more useful for you. This book was written by German missionaries, published in Bautzen in Upper Silesia in 1854, and it was for German missionaries going out to modern Suriname. And this was interesting, although it was the Dutch Guiana, the language was an English base and not a Dutch base Creole. Okay, so then time went on, grammars were produced. The first grammars, however, were fairly rigid types of books. They were just recording languages as though they were Latin. And then in the 17th century, things started to change, and you got, you'll see the first really important book was a French grammar published in 1660 called known as the Grammar of Port-Royal, which was produced by Jansenist monks in Paris. And this was an attempt, really in the spirit of the Enlightenment, to free people's thinking and think of language as representing the way people think, the way that they function, that languages can be different from each other, and it's not just a dry recording of a language as if it were Latin. Here are some of the earlier grammars. The first one is a grammar of Hungarian from 1610. Then we have, although that's a bit later, it's a Portuguese grammar. The main grammar of Italian was written by Pietro Bembo in the 16th century. This is a copy from 1586. And then you've got another one at the end, which is not a grammar, but it's a criticism of a book called Kruska, which was a dictionary. And this criticism is saying, look, you guys produced this Kruska, which is not relevant to modern Italian. It's completely out of date, and we need to look at this from a very modern point of view. I'm not going to talk about Italian very much. In fact, I'm not going to talk about the Western European major languages very much. But one thing you see in Italian and Greek is that there is a nostalgia for the greatness of Latin and the greatness of ancient Greek, and a refusal to accept a modernization. And the modernization only came later because people forced it and said, look, what's the point of writing everything in ancient Greek or medieval Greek when people are speaking a completely different language today? And this is the Port-Royal, Grammaire Générale et Raisonnée, very much the spirit of the Enlightenment. And what is the Enlightenment? The Enlightenment was a rejection of a dogmatic approach to thinking represented by the Roman Catholic Church. I'm sorry if there are dogmatic Roman Catholics here, but they're much more open-minded today than they were then. It was looking at things from a scientific point of view, from the point of view of philosophy, of reason, and some of the famous names associated with this are people like Descartes, Voltaire, Rousseau, Adam Smith, Immanuel Kant. So, and of course they were against absolute monarchy and much more for constitutional monarchy, constitutional government. So books were produced like people tried, the world became more open then, Europe became more open, people started to travel. Here are books, for example, this is a pocket dictionary, it's about this thick, but people traveled with lots of luggage in those days. And this is another edition of the Grammaire Royale, which was a new edition of what I showed you previously, which went on for 150 years, and it was constantly revived. But you have to understand, people who participated, who want to take advantage of the Enlightenment, there were basic languages that they all learned. They all learned Italian, they all learned French, they learned German and Latin. English wasn't considered one of the top languages. It was an important language, but people in Europe did not learn English as a priority. The others were more important. At least that's my observation. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And these were particularly important. There was an Italian called Veneroni who wrote a 4-language dictionary. This is the German version of it, called the Imperial Dictionary. It appeared in 4 parts. And then this is Le Maître Italien ou la Grammaire Françoise et Italienne. This was for French people to learn Italian. And then here is a later edition of the Port-Royal grammar. Translations were really important because by translating books, you were transferring ideas from one culture to another culture and helping them open their minds. One of the most popular books that was translated in the 18th century was Telemachus by Fenelon, a book that's completely forgotten today, a book that was already considered in the 18th century as very dull, and by the end of the 18th century, it was written, I think, in 1689 originally. By the end of the 18th century, it was consigned to being a compulsory school reading. Nobody read it for pleasure. But the book is important because it is almost the beginning of the Enlightenment philosophy. Telemachus was the son of Ulysses, and he had a teacher called Mentor, and Mentor was instructing him in the art of government. And basically the art of government was to be generous, to be open, to be almost democratic, and it was a plea for constitutional aristocratic government against absolute monarchy and against the dominance of the church. So here you see the book. It was translated in over 200 languages. It was a total one of the top bestsellers of the 18th century. And here you see it in Latin, in Hungarian, in Romanian, and the other one, the last one, is in modern Greek, published in 1808 in Budapest. And also philosophy was very important, not just novels like Voltaire and stuff like that, which were translated in mass, but you saw language developed through the translation of philosophical works. The first one is Logica, translated by Samuel Klein into Romanian. These are based on the philosophical works of Christian Baumann. And the second one is a Russian work translated by Prince Antioch Cantemir. Prince Antioch Cantemir was a fantastic character. His father was Dimitri Cantemir, who was Prince of Moldova. And both of them were not just kings or princes, they were also real sponsors of culture. He spoke several languages, including Turkish, French, Russian, and Romanian. And at the age of 36, he died at the age of 36. He was considered the father of Russian poetry. He was a philosopher, and he was ambassador to Paris. That's not bad for 36. And this was an important book. This is Fontenelle's Discourse on Other Worlds, which was not liked by the Orthodox Church. The book was banned, actually, by the Orthodox Church because it was talking about conversations with people on other planets, and the Orthodox Church didn't like the idea of people living on other planets. But both books were important. This is an early Russian book. Remember, this is in Russian, not in Slavonic. This is an early Russian book, and it introduced a lot of new words, philosophical words, also like Klein into Romanian, Cantemir into Russian. Here is 19th century Dickens in Hungarian. So you've got Nehéz idők. Anybody can translate any Hungarian under people here? Anybody can? Very good. Are you Hungarian? No, well done. Hard times. How about the second one? Can anybody translate the second one? That's a really difficult one. Can anyone translate the second one? No? Okay, that was a bit difficult. How about the third one? Can you translate that one? No? I can see you're still asleep. Okay, second one is Barnaby Rudge. The third one, Robin Hood. You wouldn't have guessed that, would you? But what's interesting is to see the way they translated Dickens's name. He wasn't Charles Dickens, he was Dickens Károly, because they translated the name into Hungarian. And the other one here is Robin Hood. Everybody's heard of Robin Hood, but the author of Robin Hood was a guy called George James, who I think, has anybody heard of George James? No. Everybody's heard of Robin Hood, nobody's heard of George James, but he was the guy who wrote Robin Hood, and nobody's heard of him. Here we have 3 books, Shakespeare, Julius Caesar, and Cape Man van Venetian. Anybody know what language that could be? No? I mean, we're linguists here. No one could answer these questions. Yeah? Okay, what? Frisian. Which Frisian? West Frisian, good. Second book is anybody tell me what that one is? No? That's the third one. The second one is Comedy of Errors in Ottoman Turkish. And the third one is Armenian, and which play is that by Shakespeare? What? Well Done. Okay. Language books also serve a political purpose. For example, after 1815, what used to be the Austrian Netherlands, which we think of as Belgium today, was united with Holland. Therefore, there was a demand for people to learn Dutch. So you find Nouvelle Grammaire pour apprendre le flamand. Everybody wanted to learn Dutch. There was a school in Dordrecht. This was the second edition, because the first one sold out in 5 minutes, of language. What? You can't imagine it selling out in 5 minutes? Well, and the third one is interesting. That was during the Napoleonic Wars, when Schleswig-Holstein in northern Germany was directly ruled by Denmark. This was a book for citizens of Schleswig-Holstein who were interested in learning Danish. This is very relevant for our group today. This is one of the great forgotten books. It's incredible. 1707, Edward Llwyd, right? Llwyd wrote it. He was a Welshman, and he wrote an encyclopedia, a collection of all British languages known at the time. He covered Breton. He wrote the first grammar of Cornish. There was a grammar and dictionary of Scots Gaelic and also of Irish. There was a translation, actually, first English translation of the first Irish grammar, which was written around 1660, in Latin. Here appeared for the first time in English. Completely forgotten book, but really important. But it shows the character of the times, that Edward Llwyd was Welsh, knew no Cornish whatsoever, went there for 6 weeks and wrote an authoritative Cornish grammar. So, and here we are again. This is one of the first grammars, I think, of Breton in 1728. And there we have a later book on Cornish, 1793. That was the second grammar, and one on Manx. Manx from 1858, I think it is. What's interesting is that if you read the preface of the Cornish and the Manx books, both of them, this is 1793, he says that, he was saying that the language is barely spoken, and the only people who speak Cornish, and this is in 1793, are illiterate, completely primitive type people who live in the extremities of Cornwall. And similarly, in the Manx, in the introduction, this was a book that was produced by the Manx Society, which was a society for the promotion of Manx culture. He said in the introduction, our aim is not to promote the use of Manx, because that's finished, but it's to preserve and to keep on the tradition of the language. So in both cases, 1793, 1858, you're seeing a language, both these languages were in very poor shape. One of the points that was mentioned yesterday, I think you mentioned this yesterday on Cornish, was that the reason why it died out was, one of the reasons that it died out was that people didn't want to speak it at home. I mean, it was, a language spoken by primitive, uncouth people. So you didn't want your children speaking Cornish. So at home, in better households, Cornish wasn't spoken, and it was discouraged. The other thing is important is, although in Manx, which I think is stronger than Cornish, because Cornish is very much down here, Manx had a Bible published in around 1790 for the first time. There was never a Bible produced in Cornish, and that was a really important fact for the decline of the language. Here's Welsh. These are sermons by Griffith Jones. I don't know if anybody's heard of Griffith Jones. He was a great personality in Wales in the 18th century. He developed the concept of circulating schools, and he was one of the originators of Methodism. So he was somebody who promoted the Methodist religion, and he had circulating schools. And the one at the end there is a grammar, interestingly. It's a grammar in English. It's a grammar of English for Welsh people who couldn't speak English. So the idea that everybody in Wales could speak English, absolutely not. The other thing that you see in the 18th century, the beginning of phrase books. People traveled around, so they wanted to be able to speak to each other, order things when they arrived somewhere, just like they did today. And the other source of demand for phrase books were soldiers. So the one on the right there is a book that was produced during the Crimean War with phrases in French, English, Turkish, and Russian. And here we have one that was published in Buda in 1796, where if you look at it, the quality of the English is really poor. This capon is very fat, and to speak the truth, a princely bit. If you have a new good knife, I'll do it. I will then taken away the pottage. I'm sure you get this guy, he must be English. I mean, speaks so well, he must be a native speaker. But I suppose it was better than nothing. This is a fun book. This is a phrase book in 10 languages in Romanian, and somebody has written on it in Romanian that it says, Această carte este pentru folosul acelor indivizi care se va ocupa de dansa foarte, foarte necesară, which means this book is for the use of people who like dancing, and it's really, really necessary for them. And there are tips there on how to be charming with ladies as well. It says, perhaps I shall have the pleasure of seeing you again before you set out. Ladies, when was the last time anybody spoke to you like that? And she replies, certainly, I will call on you before I leave. I shall be very much obliged to you. I am very happy that I can do this trifling service. This is the way that people, men and women, should be speaking to each other. So, languages, what I was talking about, forming of cultural identity. So you've got all this bubbling around, languages being formed, and then people realized that, particularly in Central Europe, where there was a whole mishmash of different cultures, they realized that, they should be focusing on creating a linguistic structure, a language. You know, they wanted their language because they said, we Hungarians want to be on the same level as Germans or French, we want our language. So they went through a process of modernization. First of all, they tried to determine where their language, this is Hungarian, where the language came from. Now, this is a very important book about the origin of Hungarian language. The book was by Fergus Sajnovic, who said, Hungarian, the title of the book, Hungarian and Lappish is the same language. The second book is about the same theme, which shows the affinities between Finnish and Hungarian. Not everybody agreed with this. This book here tries to demonstrate that Finnish is in fact derived from Greek. The second one, that Hungarian is derived from Ethiopian. And the third one was by a great character called Alexandra Kurushi Choma, who wrote the first Tibetan dictionary and grammar, who went to India because he thought the Hungarians came from there. So this was always a question of debate. Then here you see the early grammars, which were influenced by German Enlightenment thinking. The first one was influenced by Lange, who was a philosopher and a priest in Halle, and the second one by Christian Adelung, who is an important character in the development of language in Germany. And then you had a war. This is very, very common. In Hungary, there was a war between people who believed in modernizing the language and those who believed in keeping the old spelling and stuff like that. They were called the neologs and the orthoologs. And what happened at the end, if you ask a Hungarian, what was the result and what was the whole war about, a language war about? Nobody knows. Nobody can tell you, because actually the result was a draw, and there's one fellow called Ferenc Kazinczy who took both streams together, and you have modern Hungarian. Similarly, you see the same in Romanian, but Romanian was much more radical, because in Romanian, language reform meant getting rid of the Slav connection and developing an identity as a Latin language based on Roman roots. So this is the first printed grammar in Romanian was very late, 1780. And then this was another one in 1787. That was the second one. And then you see the third one was 1805. Actually, it was the second edition of the first one. What's very interesting, vital point when you're talking about Romania, is that the people who developed the Romanian language didn't live in the Romanian part, which was in the Ottoman Empire. They lived in Transylvania. They were not Orthodox, but Greek Catholic. And they could also speak many languages. They spoke Serbian, they spoke Hungarian. In fact, they lived in Hungary for a while. All Shinkai, Klein, and then also another person, Petru Major. These are great characters in the language reform in Romania, all had lived in Hungary. So what I want to show also is that the cultural evolution was not something, we are Hungarian and they're Romanian and we're better than they are. Everybody was working together to create, and it was absolutely not confrontational. It was an intellectual confluence in trying to create a cultural identity. This is really, really bizarre. The book in the middle is the first complete book known in Romanian, written with Latin letters. But it's not just written in Latin letters, it's written in Latin letters as if it were Hungarian. So it's Romanian written in Hungarian style. Yeah? Why? Because this was for church use. Hungarians, Romanians lived together in villages. Hungarians understood Romanian but couldn't read the Cyrillic, so they produced a book for them in Romanian but written in a way that they could read it. Very, very unusual book. The only copy of that book that exists, and I bought that in an auction in Hungary about 5 years ago, and they didn't know it was the only copy, so that's a really great thing. And then did Hungarian come from Finland? Or is it Finnish and Lappish? Romanian, the big thing is, does it originate from the Romans, or does it have other origins? There was a strong movement which said it was from the Romans, but those who were against Romanian nationalism, particularly later, said no. The people who came, the Roman settlers, were not Romans. They were not centurions, Romanian troops. They were colonists from all over the Romanian Empire who were sent there. So you can't say that it's just an extension of the Romanian language. Anyway, so this debate and this book here, Die Herkunft der Rumänen, was very much an anti-Romanian book, which said that this is complete rubbish, that these were, just Slavs and had nothing to do. This rubbish, this stuff about the Roman Empire. Eventually, the script changed from Cyrillic to Roman script. This is a very early attempt, this book in 1819. It's the thickest book in Roman script. Then you had from 1835 to 1865 a transitional script there on the right-hand side, which was a mixture between Cyrillic and Roman. And now we come to the point of nationalism. I believe that my observation is that you can't be nationalist unless you've got a language. And then what you had is that once the Hungarian language became more stable, then they started pushing the Hungarian language in various parts of the Hungarian kingdom. The book on the right is a Grammar of Hungarian in Romanian, 1832. The one in the middle, a Grammar of Hungarian in Serbian. And the one at the left here is a grammar of the Romanian language. So this book was written by Aaron Pumnul, who was Mihai Eminescu, the great Romanian poet's teacher in Czernowitz, and he wrote this book. He was a great nationalist. Greek, modern Greek, the origins of modern Greek was also very much from Romania. Romanians Greeks who were living in the Romanian territory. So this is the idea of all sorts of nationalities living there. Just briefly then, because we're running out of time, going on to Russian, Serbian, they emerged out of Slavonic. This is the first Slavonic grammar in the 1648 edition with representing the Moscow dialect. This is the first trilingual dictionary, Latin, Greek, and Slavonic. And these are very early Russian texts, because you have to understand the Russian language, only this book in the middle, which is the French translation of Lomonosov's grammar, which was the milestone of modern Russia. That's really when you can talk about Russian in the modern grammatical sense. And this is also a Slavonic book published in Lviv, which shows the variants, the regional variants of the Slavonic language, using words that you would not find in a Moscow edition. And here we have the nationalism of the Ukraine, because one thing in the Russian Empire, different from the British Empire, the Russians used their language as a way of asserting control over their empire, and they suppressed national languages. On one side, they suppressed them. On the other side, they studied them to help administration. But you could produce a book in St. Petersburg about Ukrainian, but it was a big problem in Kiev. So you'll see this. I'll just show another slide on that in a minute. Here you have the beginnings of Serb nationalism, Serb identity. Serb developed from Church Slavonic through Serbo-Slavonic, Russo-Slavonic, until Vuk Karadžić created or put together, presented the modern Serb language. Here he is, Srbi svi I svuda. Is that the right way to say it? Somebody who knows what? Serbs here and everywhere. Okay, so the idea of Serbia being, and this is Croatian. Emerging, modern Croatian is in fact a choice between various dialects that were spoken, and the winner was Stokavian dialect. Again, coming back to Russian, the study of various languages, not only within the empire, but those on the borders, because they were looking to expand. Here we have a book on Kalmyk, published in Kazan, because that's an area where they expanded. Tibetan was very important as well, written by a German living in Russia called Schmidt. And of course, we come back to the Bible, and this is the Russian Bible Society production in Romanian. Why in Romanian? Because in 1812, Bessarabia, which was Romanian-speaking, became part of Russia, and in 1816, I think, Finland became part of Russia. There was a demand, these two books here, Russian Sprachlesner for beginner in Swedish. In Finland, Swedish was the main language for administration, and they desperately needed people who spoke Russian, because of course nobody in Finland spoke Russian, and here it was the same. There was a shortage of Russian speakers in Moldova, in Bessarabia, so grammars were produced. British were different. They spoke English, but they didn't impose English on everybody. English was the administrative language, but they went out and missionaries helped. This is a missionary who wrote the Maori book there. it was important to learn the local language. Hindustani is an important exception to this. Hindustani was a language created by the British to cut across all the regional languages and apply a uniform way of communication. And this is actually resented by some Indians today because they say, well, the British, through their colonial policy, destroyed a lot of the local languages. Maltese, also promoted by the British in a written form, they introduced the European, the Roman letters. There, that's a curiosity. That's the first piece of literature written in Maltese, Robinson Crusoe, 1846, translation. It was the first book that was translated into Maltese and the first non-religious book published in Maltese. Here we have a Romansh from Switzerland, and interesting, first Bible, lots of printing of Romansh. First Bible came out in 1648, but why is it so weak, the language? It's weak because a different language is spoken or dialect in every valley, and that's why it's very difficult to get a common view of Romansh. And here we have Occitan coming back to the same problem as we had with Cornish, that it was a language spoken by servants, and in fact these are plays from the 18th century which are written bilingually. So you have the seigneurs who speak French and the servants who are speaking Occitan in the same play. And this is a book by the Nobel Prize winner, it's 1904, Frédéric Mistral, who won a Nobel Prize for poetry in Occitan. So that was great for the language. And this is a book that he signed. And here we have Dolly Pentreath, who is supposedly the last speaker of Cornish, and we have a book of Shetland dialect here. And these are very, very interesting because they show the dialects, because this is not Cornish, but this is Cornish dialect of English. So you have words which probably we just are not familiar with anymore, like a kipper is a male salmon. Kitey is a flighty, harebrained, impulsive person. Kitting is stealing iron or tin ore. So these books are full of dialect, English dialect words which, you just don't know anymore. And here we come to, very near the end now, on artificial languages. This character here was produced one of the first artificial languages, 1783, a genius, a Hungarian genius called John Kama. The second one was Volapuka, which was an international language that was prior to Esperanto. Unfortunately, Esperanto very much pushed Volapuka away. And in the last one, it's a more modern book, which was the development written by Kalman Kolochai of erotic words in Esperanto, because they didn't exist, and he had to invent them. So you see, if you look carefully, you may see some words like fiki and masturbi and stuff like that, which all have erotic significance, if you understand those words. Yeah, and now, here is the last slide, which are just a few books that I couldn't fit in, but I thought they were weird because I like collecting weird books. So the first one is a book of Psalms in the Sami language of Lapland. The second one is a book for Armenians living in Transylvania to learn Hungarian. And it was financed by a small village in Transylvania where there were lots of Armenians. The third one was a play, the first piece of literature in Solring, which is a North Frisian dialect spoken on the island of Sylt next to Denmark. And this was the first piece of literature there. And the fourth one is a grammar of Sorbisch spoken in East Germany. So there we are. That's me looking at a new acquisition that just arrived in the post, sitting on my balcony in the summer, deeply involved in my new Dutch grammar that had arrived. Anyway, that was just an insight into what gives me my passion and what I virtually live for. I shouldn't say that to any member of my family, but this is where my money goes. And I hope that my insights were useful and a bit different. Thank you very much.